Okay, Josh, start off, just tell me the story about how you came to adopt agile marketing, right? I'm curious about what triggered your
Yeah.
interest and also just how you got started.
Yeah, I it was about 10 years ago or so. I was working for a software company out of Chandler, Arizona called Infusionsoft. They have since
Sure.
rebranded to Keep, but um I started there in like an inside sales role. I was, calling leads, etc. And it just wasn't I really knew that it wasn't something I wanted to keep doing.
Right.
And my manager at the time was helping manage some demand generation projects, and I could tell he was flailing. And I was like, let me help.
Right.
And so I got with and created a position that didn't even exist. It wasn't even agile at the time. It was just a project coordinator position for the demand generation team. And so
Right.
I knew that I really enjoyed project management, naturally organized. And so I did that and went through, kind of all that. And as that went on, the web development manager came to me after some time and was like, "Hey, I want you to come work with our team." They sat with inside of marketing. I was like, okay. And he mentioned a word, Scrum Master. I was like, I don't know. I don't have any idea what you're talking about. What is that? What is that? Like, I've never heard the term, didn't know anything about it. But he's
Right.
like, I think he'd be great at it. And I was like, okay, awesome. So I went over and joined his team. And then from that point, worked with him as well as they had an inside agile coach, Perry Reinhardt, that has done agile for
Yeah,
software
I
companies
know
for
Perry's
years.
name. So
Yeah,
yeah.
so he's great. And so I kind of introduced to it, did it with web development, got really introduced into Scrum and everything from planning book. I mean, all the things.
Right.
I was like, this makes a lot of sense. At the same time, we sat with inside of marketing and with inside of like the creative project manager. So she did everything traditional, waterfall, building out huge project plans. But
Right.
then our web dev step would come over and I'd be like, okay, well, we're going to manage it with, more Scrum style.
Right.
And so I had to bridge these two gaps.
Hmm.
And I was like, why are we doing this? Like, what? At one point I was like, can we just pilot? Can we try a single project just utilizing Scrum? We'll have the designer, the content person, the web dev person, front end, back end, and we'll just work on this project. We'll do, and so
Right.
worked with Perry, worked with the creative director, and they're like, yeah, let's do it.
Hmm.
So we had a part at that time, it was like a partner uh, microsite. And so we went through the whole thing,
Right.
went through, did stand up, everything. And then from that point, they were like, well, why don't we just do this across the board? And so
Right.
they started to do that. And then I left. So I left Infusionsoft and moved up to Utah with my family. And from that point, to me was just, I don't know why everybody doesn't use this, not even specifically with just marketing, but just in general. Why do teams just not adopt this way of working? It just
Right.
fundamentally makes sense. And from that point on, I pretty much have taken it everywhere I've gone. It continued to grow with inside of marketing with another organization where up in Utah, the CEO was an agilist. He taught it at Harvard. He contracted and consulted for years,
Yeah.
and he had introduced it into his marketing team, but they had no idea what they were doing, and so they hired me specifically because I had marketing experience and Scrum experience.
Right.
And from that point forward, it just
It
my
just
my
blossomed.
it just blossomed and kept growing. And from that point, I've just been embedded with inside of creative and marketing teams. And I don't I've thought of times of going to the R&D side and the software development side, and I just love the creative nature. It just would be hard for me to leave
Right.
this side of it ever.
Well,
So
let's talk about workflow, right?
yeah,
Marketers exist in workflow, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's how they think about it, right?
yeah.
How have you helped coach the marketing teams about how to improve the workflow? I'm really curious about what techniques do you use? What do you measure? How do you get them to think about improving their workflow?
Yeah, I mean, it always starts off with just finding out and doing listening tours with the teams to see where their gaps are at. I've always found that taking that time and doing, little mini retros with each of those, whether individuals or teams, to just,
Right.
hey, what's working, what's not, and what can we do about it? And just creating and looking for those elements of consistency. When I joined Workiva, that was a big element of what I did, was meeting with all the teams to find out, hey, what's working? What are we doing that we want to keep doing, but what do we need to change? And then looking for those thematics in the gaps, and then realizing, okay, hey, here are some recommendations on how we can potentially approach that.
Right.
I love Scrum just by nature of using it for so long, and just mostly enjoy it because of the habitual aspect of it, because it creates consistent habits.
Right.
And so I love to start with retros and stand-ups at a bare minimum with teams, because
Right.
one, they're the easiest thing for them to wrap their minds around. And two, I call retros reflections. One, I think there's unfortunately a negative connotation that comes with the word retro or postmortem when you talk to people about those
Right.
words. So I've always used reflection,
Right.
because that's what it is. We're reflecting back. We're reflecting on what either the sprint or the project or the quarter or whatever the case is. And so I have found that by doing those, it has helped those teams to identify on their own what they need to do, and to employ processes that we know are agile. They may not know, but we
Right.
know that, hey, that sounds great. Let's do that, and they'll just start naturally moving that direction. And so for me, that's always been my go-to, is to listen, find out, identify thematic gaps, and then to always start with those easy lifts so they can start to get some of those habits created.
Once they get beyond the stand up or the reflection, as you call retrospectives,
Yeah.
right? What are there other techniques you use? Do you ask them to measure anything? I'm just curious to dive a little more deeply into that.
Yeah. So I would say that I mean, again, I enjoy Scrum. I've done a mixture of Scrum and Kanban probably most of my time with inside of Agile. It just, the visual nature has always seemed to connect better with marketers, of being able to show and see progression of work.
Right.
But I've also dove into some elements of, SAFe, where we're doing a little bit more of big room planning and release planning, et cetera, and have used that at some of my previous organizations. I think it's a matter of what, again, the organization needs at the time, to be able to see and to propose a potential approach that will help to address that.
Right.
But I think that from a measurement perspective, I mean, it's a hard topic, because what measure, what is of value? Like at one point, with some previous teams, we measured velocity and capacity religiously. I mean,
Right.
to the point of where it was reports that we sent out every sprint. Hey, here's where we committed. Here's where our actuals, to the et cetera, et cetera. There was value in it at that time, but was it going to forever be valuable? I think at a point it became like, okay, well, we get it now. We kind of have we understand the ebbs and flows. Now what are we going to measure? And so I think that's where it becomes difficult. I do story pointing in most cases with my teams, because I want them to understand how much they can handle.
Right.
And so I always utilize the Fibonacci sequence, and training my teams to understand it's not about how long something takes, it's about how difficult something is.
Right.
And what is the effort that's going to require, and giving them some context of being able to do that way.
Right.
And that's always proved beneficial, to get some foundational understanding of how much a team can handle sprint over sprint. I have always found that that's been the most valuable.
Right.
Aside from that, from a measurement, I've done t-shirt sizing, and I see that finds some values. As soon as you get some foundational elements to be able to start understanding what an extra small actually means, and what a large means, it then starts to help feed into, okay, I'm not going to get to the story pointing level yet. I understand this is an extra large. Yes, we can handle that. It's going to take us roughly 6 sprints, something to that extent. And so those are the two that I've probably deployed the most, that I've seen most successful. But I also tell people, I'm like, choose something. It can be the number of tasks. It can be how many dog breeds, like a size, like,
Right.
it's just a matter of measurement. It just is a matter of us determining what we want to associate so that we can better understand what we can handle. Because if we overcommit and we don't deliver, then we consistently look like that we're not achieving the
Right.
outcomes that we're trying to accomplish. And we don't want that.
So Agile is also about delivering early and often and taking chances and, dealing with ambiguity and complexity and all that, stuff that,
right.
have you had a team that, I'm going to put it in quotes here, fail, that they tried something they hadn't tried before and
Yeah.
it didn't work out? Has it happened, and how did you overcome that issue?
The one, yeah. So the one team that comes to mind, I joined a production design team at a health and wellness company. They produced products like vitamins, protein powders, etc. And this team was solely responsible for creating labels. That was it, like globally. So for all their products, so they handled everything, and it was a very complex workflow.
Yeah.
Had to go through legal. It had a very specific proofing system that had to be used so that they could track if they were ever audited. Like there was a whole, because everything was FDA regulated. Like there was just a lot of complex elements, and went in just thinking, hey, I know that 2-week sprints, this Kanban approach, Scrum Kanban approach, I've seen it work multiple times with designers. I don't see why it wouldn't fit here. So went through, talked to them, kind of identified some areas where I knew that they were struggling, and then was like, hey, did a little bit of training. We're going to introduce this. They seemed to be okay, seemed to be on board, and very quickly found out that 2-week sprints just fundamentally don't work. There's no way that they could take a label from start to finish with inside of 2 weeks.
Right.
And so I was like, okay, well, let's roll back now.
It's interesting because, there's a lot of marketing things that can't be done in weeks, right?
Right.
So do they decompose those things and break them into smaller tasks, or what do they do?
So that was part of what we had to figure out. Like, how do we, what do we either need to start segmenting down further, or do we need to figure out, do we need to extend our sprint time, or do we need to do a continuous sprint, more Kanban approach where we're just really more WIP and more, hey, work in progress versus specific time boxing.
Right.
And that was what we had to play around with for a while, because what we had introduced, we quickly found out that it made us seem like that we were getting nothing done, because we would end the sprint and we would have 6 labels that were in review, but that they were going to be 3 or 4 weeks in review. There was no way that they were going to, and so it was demoralizing for the team, so they're like, well, we're not showing any element of completion. And so what we ended up shifting towards, and after a couple of trial and error, was more of that Kanban continuous. We would have a quasi sprint planning to more of like, hey, here's the new labels that came in, but it wasn't so much of, okay, hey, here's what we're specifically committing to getting completed with inside the next 2 weeks.
Right.
And that really helped. And when I left that team and a new supervisor came in, that process continued, because it was very simple for them to understand progression of work, but then also, hey, we can't really handle having 7 labels in progress at one time. The team that's too much capacity. And so it allowed for them to have more of a continuous approach, still doing retros, still finding out where we could tweak and adjust.
Right.
And one of the things we really learned was educating the stakeholder, because the stakeholder's expectation was, hey, we'll just get the label done. I'm like, well, it's not that simple, and so I had one of the designers build a puzzle infographic, and it essentially was a label that was a bunch of puzzle pieces, and it said, hey, all of these things are required in order for a label to be able to be considered complete. And that takes anywhere from, if it's a North America product, it can take this long. If it's a Asia Pacific market, or it can take this long, because it's getting translated into 6 languages. Like there's different complexities. And so it became one, educating the stakeholder, and then the team finding out what that process was. But it was hard, because for me, it was like, oh man, like I just figured, I was newer in regards to taking and applying in some different types of places. And so this, when I went into it, it was humbling for me to realize like, hey, one size doesn't fit all. And I need to be willing to take that step back and be vulnerable to say, hey, let's figure this out together. And so it was a good learning experience for me in my career for sure.
That's a great place to end. Josh, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with other members of the Agile Marketing Alliance. Really appreciate it.
Hey, I appreciate being a part of it. I love it. I tell people about it as often as I can, that there's a place for those of us that love it, and we can go and learn from one another. So I appreciate you taking the time as well.
All right. Thanks.